My mother looked at me across the kitchen island, wrapping paper still crumpled around her feet like snow that hadn't melted, and said, "I wish you'd never been my daughter." This is Family Secret Tale, real betrayals, hidden secrets, and the moments that changed everything. If stories like this hit close to home, hit subscribe and join the family. Let's get into it. She said it quietly. That was the part that took the air out of the room. If she'd screamed it, I could have written it off as a holiday meltdown, the kind every family has once the eggnog runs out and the old grudges start circling like dogs that smell food. But she said it the way you'd say something you'd been carrying around for years, waiting for the right moment to finally set it down. It was 8:40 in the morning. My brother Tyler was still holding the folder I'd handed him 10 minutes earlier, the one with the appraisal report and the loan documents and the 17 photographs I'd taken of the cabin's foundation the week before, the cracks spreading through the concrete like veins. My niece Sophie was sitting on the stairs in her pajamas, phone forgotten in her lap, watching her grandmother the way you watch weather that's about to turn dangerous. My father had been dead for 4 years, and somehow his absence was the loudest thing in that kitchen. I want to tell you what led to that sentence, because on its own it sounds like the kind of thing a cruel woman says to a daughter who deserved better. But it's not that simple. And if you've ever been the person everyone in your family calls when something goes wrong, you already know that these things are never as simple as the sentence that finally breaks you. My mother didn't say it because she hated me. She said it because I had just shown her on paper in black and white, numbers she could not argue with, that everything she had told our family for 4 years was a lie. And people don't forgive you for that. Not really. Not even the people who raised you. Let me explain how we got here. My name is Melissa Calloway. Everyone calls me Mel, except my mother, who only ever called me Melissa when she wanted something, and Mel when she was pretending she didn't. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant in Denver, which is a fancier way of saying I spend my life reading other people's financial lives for the lie hiding inside them. Insurance fraud, mostly. Staged accidents, inflated claims, business owners who burned down their own restaurants in July because the summer numbers didn't work out the way they'd promised their investors. I've testified in 11 trials. I've sat across from men who cried real tears while lying to my face about numbers that didn't cry at all. People think forensic accounting is about math. It isn't, not really. It's about patterns. A liar can hold a story together for a sentence, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for years if they're patient and the story is important enough to them. But numbers don't have that kind of patience. Numbers are the one part of a story that can't improvise. If someone tells you they spent $40 on groceries 3 days after their card shows a $200 withdrawal at an ATM 11 miles from any grocery store, the numbers already know what happened. You just have to be willing to look at them instead of at the person's face. I've built a career on being willing to look. It has cost me things. Friends who thought I was cold. A fiancé once who told me I treated our relationship like a set of books that needed to balance, which stung because he wasn't entirely wrong. I have a way of noticing small inconsistencies that other people let go, of tugging at loose threads until the whole sweater comes apart in my hands, and for a long time I thought that made me difficult to love. What I didn't understand back then, though I understand it now, was that I had been trained into that vigilance long before I ever opened an accounting textbook. I had been the family's forensic accountant since I was 12 years old, long before I knew the term existed. I just didn't call it that. I called it being the responsible one. My father, Robert Calloway, ran a small engineering firm out of a strip mall in Lakewood. He wasn't rich, but he was careful, the kind of careful that comes from growing up with nothing and deciding nothing would ever surprise him again. He kept 2 ledgers, not because he was hiding anything, but because he didn't trust banks to catch their own mistakes, and twice in his life they hadn't. He used to sit me at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons while he balanced the checkbook, and he'd let me hold the calculator, and he'd say, "The numbers don't lie, Melly. People lie. Numbers just wait for you to ask them the right question." I loved him for that. I loved him for a lot of things, but that most of all, the sense that somewhere in the chaos of a family, in the arguments and the debts, and the things nobody wanted to say out loud, there was a version of the truth you could actually find if you were patient enough and honest enough to go looking for it. My mother, Diane, was a different kind of person entirely. She wasn't a liar, not in the way you're imagining right now. She was a smoother. She believed, with the kind of conviction that borders on religious faith, that most problems could be solved by simply refusing to look at them directly, the way you're not supposed to look at an eclipse. If a bill was overdue, she'd tell you it was being handled. If Tyler failed another semester of business school, she'd tell you he was finding his path. If a marriage in the extended family was falling apart, she'd organize a group dinner and act as if the seating chart alone could hold two people together. Tyler is 2 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand the shape of our family, I understood that he occupied a different position in it than I did. It wasn't that my parents loved him more. I don't actually believe that, even now, even after everything. It was that Tyler was fragile in a way that got treated like a kind of specialness, and I was steady in a way that got treated like a resource. When Tyler crashed his car at 17, my parents spent 3 weeks managing his emotional recovery. When I got a B- on a physics exam that same year, my mother sat me down and asked what had gone wrong, in a tone that implied something had. I don't say that to be bitter. I say it because it matters for what comes later. Because by the time I was 22 and Tyler was 24, the pattern was so deeply set into the architecture of our family that none of us could see it as a pattern anymore. It just looked like who we were. Tyler struggled and needed support. I succeeded and needed nothing. And a family, like a business, will always route its resources toward the account that seems like it needs them and away from the one that seems fine on its own, without ever asking whether the fine one is fine because of the resources, or in spite of the lack of them. My father died 4 years ago. A heart attack in the parking lot of his own office at 59 on a Tuesday in March, the kind of ordinary day that makes death feel like an administrative error rather than a tragedy. I was the one who identified him at the hospital because my mother couldn't make herself walk into the room. I was the one who called the funeral home because Tyler said he couldn't think straight and needed a few days. I was the one who found the will, tucked into the same battered filing cabinet where my father had kept 2 ledgers his whole life, because he still didn't trust anyone else to keep the real numbers. The will was simple, because my father was a simple man in the best sense of that word. Everything split evenly between Tyler and me, with one specific exception: the cabin. My father built that cabin himself, over 11 summers, on 4 acres of land above Sterling Lake in the mountains 2 hours west of Denver. I have a memory, one of my clearest from childhood, of being maybe 9 years old, standing in the unfinished frame of what would become the living room. My father handing me a brass key that didn't open anything yet because the door wasn't hung. "This is yours too someday," he told me. "You and your brother both. But you're the one who'll keep the key, because you're the one who won't lose it." He wasn't wrong about that. I still have that key. I've had it on my keyring for 25 years, through 4 apartments in 2 cities and a broken engagement. A small brass weight I stopped noticing the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat, until the year everything came apart, and I understood, finally, exactly what that key had been promising me all along. The will named my mother executor, and split ownership of the cabin 50-50 between Tyler and me, with the note that Mom would retain a life estate, meaning she could use it, live in it, stay there as long as she wanted, but the property itself belonged to us. My father had thought this through carefully, the way he thought everything through. He'd wanted to protect my mother's right to the place she'd spent 30 summers in, without leaving the actual ownership vulnerable to being reshuffled after he was gone. At the time, none of this seemed like it needed protecting from anyone. We were grieving. We were a family. The idea that 4 years later I would be standing in a kitchen with an appraisal report and a forged signature, listening to my mother tell me she wished I'd never been born to her, would have seemed like something out of another family's life entirely, not ours. But grief does something to a family's finances that nobody warns you about. It doesn't just take the person who died. It takes the person who used to be the referee, the one whose presence kept certain conversations from happening because everyone knew what he would have said. My father would never have let what happened over the next 4 years happen. And I think, somewhere underneath everything, my mother knew that too, and did it anyway because for the first time in her marriage, there was no one left to say no. It started small enough that I didn't think anything of it. 6 months after the funeral, my mother called to ask if I could help cover the property taxes on the cabin, just until Tyler's restaurant gets its footing. Tyler had opened a brewery/gastropub in a converted warehouse in Golden the year before, funded partly by his half of a small life insurance payout and partly by a business loan he'd taken out against his own credit, which even then was not in great shape. I wired $1,100 without asking too many questions, because $1,100 felt like a reasonable price for keeping the peace, and because it was framed as something temporary, and because the cabin was half mine too, so wasn't I just paying my share? Then it was help with the cabin's roof, which had started leaking after a bad winter. Then it was a small bridge loan for Tyler's payroll during a slow season, for $1,000 this time, which my mother assured me Tyler would pay back as soon as summer picked up. Then it was help with her own health insurance premium, because the life insurance payout had somehow run thinner than anyone expected, though nobody could quite explain to me where it had gone. Each request came with its own reasonable-sounding story. Each request, taken individually, seemed like the kind of thing any decent daughter would do for her widowed mother and her struggling brother. It was only years later, when I finally sat down and actually did the math the way I would for any client, that I saw the total. Between the year my father died and that Christmas morning in the kitchen, I had given my family, in various forms, just under $63,000. Not loaned. Given. Because none of it ever came back, and somewhere along the way, everyone had stopped pretending it would. I told myself I didn't mind, and for a long time, that was mostly true. I had a good job. I didn't have kids, didn't have a mortgage, didn't have the kind of financial pressure Tyler had with 2 kids and a business that never quite found its footing. I told myself this was what family meant, that you gave according to your ability, and you didn't keep score, and keeping score was the thing small, bitter people did. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than the money did. I didn't give because I was being manipulated, not at first. I gave because somewhere very early, maybe around the time my father handed me that key and told me I was the one who wouldn't lose it, I had come to believe that being useful was the same thing as being loved. That if I kept being the reliable one, the one who showed up, the one who could be counted on to fix whatever needed fixing, I would eventually be seen. Not just needed. Seen. I didn't understand yet that those are 2 very different things, and that a family can need you desperately without ever once actually seeing you. The trouble is, once you become the load-bearing wall in a family structure, nobody thinks to ask if you're carrying more weight than you were built for. They just keep adding floors. The first real crack came 18 months ago, in the spring, when my mother called to tell me Tyler's brewery needed a significant infusion of capital. Not thousands this time, but tens of thousands, and she had an idea. Her idea was that she would take out a home equity line of credit against the cabin. Not her house in Lakewood, where she still lived. The cabin. The one that was, according to a legal document sitting in a fireproof box in my closet, half mine. I told her I needed to see the details before I agreed to anything, which even as I said it felt like a strange sentence to have to say to my own mother. She got quiet on the phone in a way that should have warned me, and then she said, "It's my name on the deed too, Melissa. I have a life estate. I can do this without your permission if I need to." That wasn't entirely true, and some small, cold part of me, the part that reads documents for a living, filed that fact away without fully understanding yet why it mattered. A life estate gives you the right to use and occupy a property. It does not, in Colorado or anywhere else, give you the right to encumber the underlying ownership interest of the people who actually hold title. My mother either didn't know that, or she was hoping I didn't. I said no, gently but clearly. I told her I loved Tyler, I wanted him to succeed, but I couldn't in good conscience let the cabin, my father's cabin, the one thing he'd built with his own hands and specifically protected in his will, become collateral for a business that had already burned through my savings once. She told me I was being cold. She told me Tyler was drowning, and I was standing on the shore doing math. She told me that if I really loved this family, I would find a way to make it work, the way she always found a way to make things work. And I remember thinking, even in the moment, how strange it was that finding a way to make it work always seemed to mean someone giving something up, and that someone was rarely her and never Tyler. I didn't hear anything more about it for almost 8 months, and I let myself believe, the way you let yourself believe things you want to be true, that she'd dropped the idea. She hadn't dropped it. She'd just stopped asking me. Then it was help with the cabin's roof, which had started leaking after a bad winter. Then it was a small bridge loan for Tyler's payroll during a slow season, for $1,000 this time, which my mother assured me Tyler would pay back as soon as summer picked up. Then it was help with her own health insurance premium, because the life insurance payout had somehow run thinner than anyone expected, though nobody could quite explain to me where it had gone. Each request came with its own reasonable-sounding story. Each request, taken individually, seemed like the kind of thing any decent daughter would do for her widowed mother and her struggling brother. It was only years later, when I finally sat down and actually did the math the way I would for any client, that I saw the total. Between the year my father died and that Christmas morning in the kitchen, I had given my family, in various forms, just under $63,000. Not loaned. Given. Because none of it ever came back, and somewhere along the way, everyone had stopped pretending it would. I told myself I didn't mind, and for a long time, that was mostly true. I had a good job. I didn't have kids, didn't have a mortgage, didn't have the kind of financial pressure Tyler had with 2 kids and a business that never quite found its footing. I told myself this was what family meant, that you gave according to your ability, and you didn't keep score, and keeping score was the thing small, bitter people did. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think it matters more than the money did. I didn't give because I was being manipulated, not at first. I gave because somewhere very early, maybe around the time my father handed me that key and told me I was the one who wouldn't lose it, I had come to believe that being useful was the same thing as being loved. That if I kept being the reliable one, the one who showed up, the one who could be counted on to fix whatever needed fixing, I would eventually be seen. Not just needed. Seen. I didn't understand yet that those are 2 very different things, and that a family can need you desperately without ever once actually seeing you. The trouble is, once you become the load-bearing wall in a family structure, nobody thinks to ask if you're carrying more weight than you were built for. They just keep adding floors. The first real crack came 18 months ago, in the spring, when my mother called to tell me Tyler's brewery needed a significant infusion of capital. Not thousands this time, but tens of thousands, and she had an idea. Her idea was that she would take out a home equity line of credit against the cabin. Not her house in Lakewood, where she still lived. The cabin. The one that was, according to a legal document sitting in a fireproof box in my closet, half mine. I told her I needed to see the details before I agreed to anything, which even as I said it felt like a strange sentence to have to say to my own mother. She got quiet on the phone in a way that should have warned me, and then she said, "It's my name on the deed too, Melissa. I have a life estate. I can do this without your permission if I need to." That wasn't entirely true, and some small, cold part of me, the part that reads documents for a living, filed that fact away without fully understanding yet why it mattered. A life estate gives you the right to use and occupy a property. It does not, in Colorado or anywhere else, give you the right to encumber the underlying ownership interest of the people who actually hold title. My mother either didn't know that, or she was hoping I didn't. I said no. Gently but clearly. I told her I loved Tyler, I wanted him to succeed, but I couldn't in good conscience let the cabin, my father's cabin, the one thing he'd built with his own hands and specifically protected in his will, become collateral for a business that had already burned through my savings once. She told me I was being cold. She told me Tyler was drowning, and I was standing on the shore doing math. She told me that if I really loved this family, I would find a way to make it work, the way she always found a way to make things work. And I remember thinking, even in the moment, how strange it was that finding a way to make it work always seemed to mean someone giving something up, and that someone was rarely her and never Tyler. I didn't hear anything more about it for almost 8 months, and I let myself believe, the way you let yourself believe things you want to be true, that she'd dropped the idea. She hadn't dropped it. She'd just stopped asking me. Going back through 4 years of bank statements from the small joint account my father had set up, cross-referencing them against the gifts and bridge loans I had sent over the years, I found a pattern that had nothing to do with the cabin at all. My mother had several times described specific financial emergencies to me. A medical bill, an urgent repair, a tax payment, that, according to the actual bank records, either didn't exist in the amount she'd described, or had already been covered by other funds before she asked me for money. In at least 3 instances, the money I sent for a stated purpose went instead, within days, directly into Tyler's business accounts for expenses that had nothing to do with what she'd told me. I hadn't just been generous. I had been managed. Every dollar I'd given over 4 years had been extracted using a story engineered specifically to work on me. Framed around obligation, family loyalty, the unspoken debt of being the child who was fine, who didn't need anything, who therefore owed something to the one who did. There was one detail I hadn't noticed yet, and it was the one that hurt the most when I finally saw it. Buried in an email thread between my mother and Tyler that I only found because Tyler, in a moment of carelessness, had forwarded part of it to me by mistake while trying to forward it to my mother, was a sentence that has stayed with me since the day I read it. My mother had written, "Don't worry about asking her directly. I know how to word it so she says yes." I want to tell you that reading that sentence made me angry. It didn't, not right away. It made me feel something closer to grief. The specific grief of realizing that a person you have spent your whole life trying to make proud has, instead, spent that same stretch of time studying you the way I study a fraud case. Looking for the pressure points. Learning which version of a request would land. If this kind of family story feels familiar to you, if you've ever been the person everyone calls when something goes wrong, the one who gets thanked with, "I don't know what we'd do without you," instead of actually being asked what you need, then you already know what came next wasn't really about the money at all. It was about finally being willing to look at the pattern instead of the individual requests. I decided, sometime in that stretch of sleepless research, that I was done being generous in the dark. Not done being generous. I want to be clear about that distinction because it matters to who I am and who I stayed even after everything. Done being generous without information. I would help my family if I chose to help my family with full knowledge of what I was helping and why. But I would not be quietly extracted from anymore. I requested a formal, independent appraisal of the cabin, the one Sophie would later see me hand to her father in that kitchen, not to inflate its value, but to establish, with real numbers, exactly what was at stake and exactly what the forged transfer had actually cost me. I hired the attorney formally. I drafted, with her help, a legal notice of the fraudulent transfer, along with a proposed resolution that was, by any reasonable measure, more generous than I owed anyone. I would agree not to pursue criminal fraud charges against my mother, and I would allow Tyler time to refinance the loan out of the cabin's collateral entirely, if the quitclaim deed was formally rescinded and my original half-interest was restored, in writing before Christmas. I chose Christmas as the deadline for a reason I'm not entirely proud of. Some part of me, the part that was still, after everything, 12 years old and holding a calculator at my father's kitchen table, believed that if I gave them a deadline wrapped in the one holiday my family still performed sincerely, they would finally treat this the way it deserved to be treated. As serious, as real, as something that required an actual reckoning, not another story engineered to make me feel like the unreasonable one. I sent the documents 2 weeks before Christmas. My mother called me crying, which I had expected, and told me I was destroying the family over a piece of property. Your father would never have wanted us fighting over. Which struck me as a strange thing to say about the one asset he had gone out of his way, in a legally binding document, to protect specifically for both of his children. I told her, as gently as I could manage while my hands were shaking, that I wasn't destroying anything. I was asking for the truth to be written back down where it belonged. Tyler didn't call at all. Tyler sent one text message. "You're really doing this to me right before Christmas? Classy, Mel. I want to pause here and tell you something about my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, because she played a role in what happened next that I think about often. Carol had spent 30 years being the family's Greek chorus. The one who showed up at every gathering with an opinion about how everyone else should be living, but who had never, in my memory, actually intervened in anything that cost her something. When my mother called her, upset, in the days after I sent the legal notice, Carol didn't ask a single question about whether the underlying facts were true. She simply began calling other relatives, my father's brother, 2 cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, to inform them that I was trying to take Tyler's home away from his children right before the holidays. By the time Christmas actually arrived, I had received 4 separate messages from extended family members I hadn't heard from in over a year, each one gently suggesting I let it go for the family's sake. Not one of them asked to see the deed. Not one of them asked whether my signature was actually mine. The single exception, and the reason I don't tell this story with total despair about my family, was Sophie. My niece, Tyler's oldest, 16 years old that Christmas, sharp in the specific way teenagers are sharp when they've spent years being underestimated by every adult around them. 2 days before Christmas, she texted me, not her father's phone, her own, a single message. "I found the folder in Dad's office. I know what Grandma did. I'm sorry, Aunt Mel." She didn't ask me to back down. She didn't ask me to explain myself. She was the only person in my entire extended family, that Christmas, who looked directly at what had happened instead of at the story everyone had built around it. I want to tell you that her text was the thing that gave me the courage to walk into that kitchen on Christmas morning. It wasn't, not entirely. What gave me courage, in the end, was something quieter and less dramatic. I had simply run out of the specific kind of fear that had kept me quiet for 4 years. The fear of being the difficult one. The fear that if I finally stopped absorbing whatever the family needed absorbed, there would turn out to be nothing left of my relationship with them at all, that the love I'd always assumed was underneath the usefulness had actually only ever been the usefulness, wearing love's clothes. I decided I would rather know the answer to that question than keep avoiding it. So on Christmas morning, after the presents were opened, after my mother had made her traditional cinnamon rolls from the recipe tin that had belonged to her own mother, the same tin she pulled out every December 25th without fail, a small tarnished thing with a hand-painted rooster on the lid that I'd loved since I was a child, I set the folder on the kitchen island in front of Tyler. The appraisal, the recorded deed, the notary's statement, a cover letter from my attorney, formally requesting rescission of the fraudulent transfer within 30 days. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I said, I need this fixed. Not eventually. By the date on that letter. That's when my mother, standing across the island with flour still on her hands from the cinnamon rolls, looked at me and said the sentence I opened this story with. Quietly. Like something she'd been keeping in a drawer, waiting for the day she'd finally need it. I wish you'd never been my daughter. I remember the specific, absurd detail of noticing that the rooster on the recipe tin's lid was facing away from me, toward her, as if even the kitchen itself had chosen a side. I didn't respond right away. I've thought a great deal since then about why I didn't, and I think the honest answer is that some part of me had already grieved this moment before it happened, had already run the numbers on what it would cost me to finally hold my ground, and had already decided, somewhere in the weeks of quiet, sleepless research, that I would pay that cost if it came to it. What surprised me wasn't the sentence itself. It was how much smaller it made her look saying it than any version of her I'd carried in my head for 34 years. Tyler didn't defend her. He also didn't defend me. He stood there holding the folder, staring down at the appraisal number circled in red. $231,000, more than I think either of them had actually understood the cabin was worth, and said nothing at all, which I have come to believe was its own kind of answer. I left 20 minutes later, without my coat, because I'd forgotten it in the rush of not wanting to stay in that kitchen 1 second longer than I had to. Sophie followed me out to my car. She didn't say much. She just hugged me, hard, the way you hug someone when you don't have the words yet for what you actually want to say, and told me she'd call me later. What happened over the following weeks was, in some ways, worse than the Christmas morning confrontation itself, because it happened slowly, in 100 small cuts instead of one clean one. My mother stopped answering my calls for 11 days. Carol organized what she called a family meeting. No lawyers, just relatives, in her living room, an ambush dressed up as mediation, where I was asked repeatedly, by people with no legal standing and no actual knowledge of the facts, to just let this go for everyone's peace of mind. My uncle, my father's own brother, told me that my father would be ashamed of how I was handling this, a sentence that landed with real force, because for one terrible moment I let myself wonder if he was right, before I remembered, because I had the paperwork, because I always had the paperwork, that my father had written a legal document specifically to prevent exactly what my mother had done. He hadn't left ambiguity. She had manufactured it. The counterattack escalated in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. My mother's attorney, she'd hired one within days of my notice, which told me something about how seriously she was actually taking this beneath the performance of hurt feelings, sent a letter arguing that the original quitclaim deed was valid because I had, in a phone call 18 months earlier, verbally consented to the arrangement. This was not true, and I knew it was not true, but I also understood, with the cold clarity my job has trained into me, that memory is a battlefield and not a courtroom, and that if this went to trial, it would come down to documents, not feelings. I was, for the first time in my life, deeply grateful to be the kind of person who kept records of things other people assumed nobody would ever need to see. There was a moment about 6 weeks after Christmas when I nearly gave in. My mother called, and for once she didn't lead with an accusation. She cried real tears, I believe, though I've learned that real tears and true intentions aren't always the same thing, and told me she'd made a terrible mistake, that she missed me, that she wanted to fix things the right way together, like a family. She invited me to dinner, just the two of us, at the restaurant where my father used to take her for their anniversary every year. I went. I wanted more than I can easily explain for that dinner to be real. I wanted my mother to hand me back not just the deed, but some version of the relationship I'd spent my whole life building around the belief that if I gave enough, eventually she would see me the way she saw Tyler. Not as the reliable one, but simply as her daughter, unconditionally, the way you're supposed to see a child. Halfway through dinner, after the apology, after the tears, after she'd reached across the table and taken my hand in a way that undid something in my chest I'd spent weeks trying to hold shut, she said, "I'll sign whatever you need, Melissa." I just need you to also agree not to pursue anything about the money. The loans, the other things. We start clean. As a family. I understood, in that instant, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, exactly what the dinner had been. Not reconciliation. Negotiation, dressed in the language of love, the same way the forged deed had been dressed in the language of family necessity, the same way 4 years of quiet extraction had been dressed in the language of a mother simply needing her daughter's help. The apology had a price, and the price was my silence about everything else. I told her, as steadily as I could, that I couldn't agree to that. Not because I wanted to destroy her. I want to be honest that I never once, through any of this, wanted to see my mother in handcuffs, wanted her to lose her freedom, or her home, or her place at whatever remained of our family's table. I wanted the truth acknowledged. I wanted the cabin back, legitimately in writing. And I could not, in good conscience, sign away my right to ever address the rest of it, because doing so would mean agreeing that what had happened to me for 4 years didn't actually happen, and I had spent too many sleepless nights building the file that proved it had. She stood up from the table before the check came. She didn't say goodbye. That was, I think, the actual end of the reconciliation fantasy I'd been quietly holding on to since I was old enough to understand there was something to reconcile. The resolution, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic compared to everything that led up to it, which I've since learned is often how these things go. Real endings rarely look like the confrontations you imagined in the shower at 2 a.m. My attorney and my mother's attorney negotiated for another 2 months. Tyler, facing the very real possibility of losing the brewery loan collateral entirely if the fraudulent deed was voided outright by a court, finally pushed my mother to settle rather than fight. The cabin's title was restored to its original terms, Tyler and me 50-50, with my mother's life estate intact, because even after everything, I hadn't wanted to take away the one place she'd built 30 years of summers. Tyler refinanced the brewery loan using his own assets, which meant selling a piece of equipment and taking on new debt at a worse rate, a consequence I won't pretend I felt entirely sorry about. I declined, in the end, to pursue criminal fraud charges against my mother, not because I forgave her, but because I understood, somewhere in that long process, that what I actually wanted was never her punishment. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of my own head. Once it existed in a signed, notarized, legally binding document, I found I didn't need anything else from the courts. I want to tell you what happened after, because I think the after matters more than the confrontation itself, more than the courtroom threats and the family meetings and the dinner with the price tag hidden inside it. I didn't get my mother back, not in the way I once wanted. We speak now, occasionally, carefully, the way you speak to someone you love but no longer entirely trust, which is its own kind of grief, quieter than the loud one, the kind that doesn't have a funeral to mark it. She has never apologized for the forged signature. I've made a kind of peace with that, though peace might be too generous a word. I've stopped waiting for it. Tyler and I are still working out what we are to each other. He called me about 4 months after the settlement and told me, in a voice that sounded more honest than I'd heard from him in years, that he hadn't known about the forgery until after it was done, that my mother had told him she'd worked it out with me, and that he had chosen, for a long time, not to ask too many questions because the answers were more convenient that way. I believe him mostly. I also understand that his not asking was its own kind of choice, one he'll have to make peace with in his own time, the way I've had to make peace with mine. Sophie and I talk every week now. She's 17, applying to colleges, and last month she told me she wants to study accounting. Like you, but for real crimes, not just the family kind. I laughed harder at that than I had in months. I think, in a family that spent 4 years teaching me that being useful and being loved were the same thing, Sophie is the one relative who taught me the opposite lesson. That you can simply see someone clearly without needing anything from them, and that this not the giving, not the fixing, is what love actually looks like when it isn't attached to a price. I still have the brass key on my keyring. I drove up to the cabin alone last month, in early spring, before the roads were fully clear, just to stand in the living room my father built with his own hands, and look out at Sterling Lake through windows he'd installed the summer I turned 11. I brought the recipe tin with me. My mother gave it to me without ceremony a few weeks after the settlement, sliding it across her kitchen counter and saying only, "You should have this. You're the one who keeps things." I don't know if she meant it as an apology. I've decided I don't need it to be one. I stood in that unfinished feeling living room, key in my hand, tin under my arm, and I thought about the sentence my mother said to me on Christmas morning, the one that broke something open in that kitchen and eventually in me. I wish you'd never been my daughter. For a long time after, I heard that sentence as a verdict. Something true about how little I'd actually mattered beneath all the years of being needed. But standing in that cabin months later, with proof in a folder that the truth had, in fact, held, that the numbers, once someone was finally willing to ask them the right question, had told a story my mother could not talk her way out of, I understood the sentence differently. She hadn't said it because I'd failed to be a good daughter. She'd said it because I had, for the first time in her life, refused to let her story win against the facts. She wished I'd never been her daughter, because her daughter was the one person in the family who couldn't be talked out of what was actually true. My father used to tell me the numbers don't lie, people do. I think what he was really trying to teach me, all those Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table, calculator in my small hands, was something bigger than accounting. He was teaching me that somewhere underneath every story a family tells itself to survive, there is a version of events that actually happened, and that a person who is willing to go looking for it, even when it costs them everything they thought they wanted, will eventually find something more valuable than being needed. They'll find out who they actually are, once nobody needs them to be anything else. If you've ever been the one everyone calls when something goes wrong, the reliable one, the fixer, the person who gives and tells herself that's just what family means, I hope you hear this the way I finally learned to hear it. Being useful was never the same thing as being loved. It took me 34 years and a forged signature to understand the difference. I hope it doesn't take you that long. I still keep the key on my ring. But these days, it doesn't feel like a burden I'm the only one strong enough to carry. It feels like exactly what my father meant it to be, all those years ago, standing in an unfinished doorway, handing a 9-year-old girl something he trusted her not to lose. It feels finally like mine.